Deep Sea Embers Chapter 366 to 370. With an air of innocence and joy, young Annie exited, her footsteps echoing with a happy rhythm as she sauntered away. Despite her childlike demeanor, there was no hint of unease or doubt about her actions. After all, she was still but a child, blissfully ignorant of the world's hidden intricacies and forebodings. Meanwhile, the elderly caretaker stood as an immovable statue at the entryway of the cemetery. His gaze was fixated on Annie's diminishing silhouette, a contemplative expression etched on his weathered face. It took him a considerable amount of time to rouse himself from this prolonged state of rumination. Then, with trembling fingers revealing his advanced age and possible anxiety, he gingerly reached into the confines of his chest pocket, retrieving a small vial filled with medicinal substance. He carefully administered the concoction orally, relief washing over him as the effect took hold. "I can't shake this off, it's unnerving, I must relay this to the cathedral without delay. O mighty God of death, this anomaly is simply too confounding." His words trailed off into faint whispers as he pivoted abruptly, aiming for the direction of the caretaker's quarters. Upon entering his modest cabin, he secured the door behind him and strode towards a somewhat antiquated desk that lay next to his bed, revealing a hidden panel on the desk's surface. An array of complex pipes, valves, buttons, and levers came into view, an engineering marvel hidden in plain sight. Amongst this network of pipes lay a few metal capsules, inconspicuously nestled within small compartments. With a sense of urgency, the old man retrieved a sheet of parchment from his desk drawer and busied himself with a fountain pen. His hand moved swiftly across the paper, penning down his observations into a formal report. Once the documentation was completed, he meticulously rolled it up and secured it within a metal capsule. The capsule was then inserted into an open slot in the pipe compartment of the desk. May Bartok bestow blessings upon these pipes and the air coursing through them, may the valves function impeccably without experiencing any clogs, pressure drop, or volatile reaction, and may the differential machine at the sorting and delivery center avoid any operational mishaps. His prayer faded into the quiet room, and without losing another moment, he engaged a button adjacent to the pressurized pipe. A green indicator in the compartment lit up, signaling the all clear, upon which he manipulated a lever at the button's side. A peculiar bubbling noise, suggestive of air blockage, emanated from the bowels of the pipe system. However, this was promptly replaced by the steady hiss of the pressure pipe in full operation and the swift movement of the capsule through the system. The elderly caretaker anxiously studied the pipe, murmuring apprehensively, could the mention of divine entities in the letter have meddled with the mechanical system? After a tense period, the green lights indicating a successful, express delivery, to the higher sorting center were lit, and the old caretaker sighed in relief. With one last glance, he shut the panel enclosing the pipe compartment. Meanwhile, Alice was engrossed in her own explorations, meandering down a bustling street while clutching a sizable paper bag. Her eyes roved over the diverse architectural features that surrounded her, soaking in the uniqueness of this city that was so unlike planned. She found the urban lifestyles fascinating, observing the townsfolk and their daily routines. The paper bag she was carrying contained a mix of fresh produce she had picked up from a local store tucked away in a corner. It was filled with a variety of vegetables, fresh eggs, a block of frozen butter, and a couple of cuts of succulent lamb. These were the components of the delicious meal she planned to prepare for lunch. Alice had begun to independently navigate the nuances of shopping, although her skills were still developing. There were occasions when she failed to accurately compute the necessary change. However, her determination was unwavering, and she persisted in her attempts to learn these intricate tasks. Her progress might have been slow, but it was steady, and every day, she made small but meaningful advancements. With her head slightly bowed, Alice held the shopping bag securely in one hand while the other retrieved a piece of paper nestled within the bag's contents. She examined this paper intently. It was her guide to shopping, a list of items that she needed. The writing on this paper was somewhat irregular, the uneven strokes revealing a beginner's hand. A combination of recognizable words and simple sketches represented her shopping list. Some words were familiar to her, others less so, and these had been replaced with crude illustrations. This was a product of her effort in her struggle to create a reliable shopping guide. Alice had embraced the responsibility of planning her daily meals, determining the ingredients she needed, drafting her shopping list, physically purchasing items from the store, attempting to make precise calculations about the change due, and finally, ensuring a timely return home. The prospect of successfully accomplishing all these tasks was enough to bring a smile to the captain's face. The sense of accomplishment brought Alice a sense of joy, too. After cross-verifying the contents of the bag with her handwritten list, Alice was satisfied that she had successfully completed her task. Folding the paper carefully, she stowed it away and resumed her journey back to her temporary dwelling on Oak Street. However, her attention was abruptly diverted by a sudden commotion arising from a nearby street corner. Raising her gaze towards the source of the clamor, Alice noticed a group of about a dozen individuals huddled around an antiquated residential structure. They were engaged in animated discussions, gesturing towards the building while exchanging remarks. Phrases like, "The woman has gone mad," "Poor soul," and "The church has been alerted," floated around, adding to the sense of urgency and intrigue. A wave of curiosity swept over Alice, causing her to slow down her pace until she was rooted to the spot, her eyes fixed on the gathering. There was an enticing energy about the crowd, but Alice remembered the captain's advice: joining such a gathering might lead to unnecessary complications. Especially if her head, an unusual feature, were to dislodge in the middle of the crowd, it would certainly escalate the situation. Yet, the scene unfolding before her seemed incredibly interesting. It also appeared to be something that the captain might find valuable. Caught in the throes of indecision, Alice found herself instinctively drifting closer to the scene. "I'll just go over and investigate. I'll gather information for the captain. This isn't mindless curiosity, it's a serious inquiry." Alice rationalized her decision, convincing herself that her actions were justified. Securing her head with one hand and clutching the paper bag with the other, Alice confidently merged with the throng, her gaze joining others in scrutinizing the building. The building in question was markedly different from the two-story house that the captain had temporarily rented. It looked older, more cramped, its narrow windows and exposed gas pipes adding to its congested appearance. It gave the impression of being shared by multiple tenants, each living in their individualized space. The chatter among the crowd was a cacophony of disjointed snippets of information, leaving Alice more confused than before. After trying to piece together the fragmented conversation for a while, she decided to directly inquire about the situation. She gently tapped the shoulder of a man standing nearby and, with an air of polite curiosity, asked, "Excuse me, could you tell me what's happening here?" The man initially started at her touch but seemed to relax upon seeing that the inquiry came from a young lady, modestly shrouded by a veil. He gestured upwards towards the building and began to explain, "It seems a woman has lost her senses. She claims to have killed her husband and now threatens to harm her own child. First, the local law enforcement was alerted, and now, even the church has been drawn into the situation. I suspect this may be more serious than it appears." No sooner had he finished than another bystander chimed in, "If the church is involved now, could this mean there's something supernatural at play? I hope it doesn't escalate." A woman interjected from within the crowd, her voice laced with worry, "I live directly beneath them. If anything happens, we'll have nowhere to go. Regardless of what it may be, a visit to the church for an exorcism wouldn't hurt." "Better safe than sorry," a voice of reason echoed within the clamoring crowd. As the murmurings of the crowd resumed their earlier pitch, Alice felt herself being swept along the tide of unintelligible chatter. Her gaze instinctively followed the direction everyone was pointing upwards. Hovering above her field of vision, she could see slender threads floating in the air. There were many more such threads emanating from the surrounding residential structures, swaying gently in the breeze as if strands of silken hair dancing in the wind, creating a subtle, mesmerizing pattern in the sky. Alice blinked in surprise. She observed that a few of the threads above the city seemed exceptionally ethereal and transparent, their luminosity fluctuating as if in sync with some unseen rhythm. Inside the ancient residential structure, a faint musty odor lingered. The antiquated plumbing system was leaking at various points, and the intermittent dripping sound echoed eerily in the otherwise silent building. A group of guardians, their black robes flowing ominously around their bodies, and carrying staffs and lanterns, were assembled in the living room, which made the already tight quarters appear oppressively cramped. In the corner of the room, on an old worn-out sofa, crouched a woman with disheveled long hair. She was huddled in fear, her head bowed, muttering indiscernible sentences intermittently. Two of the black-robed guardians were stationed close to her, cautiously monitoring the mentally fragile woman while their comrades continued their investigation of the home. They had been diligently scouring the place for clues for almost 2 hours now. Suddenly, a gust of gray wind swept down the hallway, passing through the open doorway and swirling into the living room. Upon its arrival, the guardians halted their investigation one by one and respectfully acknowledged the gray-white whirlwind. Emerging from the vortex, Agatha surveyed the room with a discerning gaze. "What's the current situation?" she asked, shifting her attention to the most senior guardian in the room. The guardian captain, a woman who sported a neat, black bob, took a step forward, responding to gatekeeper Agatha's query. "We discovered a small quantity of a substance akin to mud on the bathroom floor, which corresponds with samples we've collected in past cases." "Primal matter," Agatha murmured under her breath, her brows furrowing in thought. "A small sample, you say? How small? Is that the entirety of what was found?" "Roughly equivalent to a test tube's volume," the captain demonstrated using her hands. "That's all we were able to find. We've combed through the entire building, and the residue was solely confined to the bathroom floor." Agatha nodded in silence, her gaze shifting towards the disheveled woman cowering in the corner of the sofa. "Is she the individual in question?" she asked. "Yes," the squad leader affirmed with a nod, "she is a resident here. Our background check on her didn't reveal anything suspicious. She's got a clean slate with no prior run-ins with the law. She works as an accounts keeper for a local firm. Moreover, her husband used to be employed in the metal mines. According to official records, he passed away in a mining accident about 3 years ago." The metal mines, a mining accident. Perhaps the recent chain of events triggered her instincts, but Agatha couldn't help but make a mental note of these critical details. With a composed demeanor, she approached the woman, who continued to mutter incomprehensibly to herself. "Ma'am, I'm the city's gatekeeper, and you are safe now," Agatha assured her, employing her power subtly to calm the woman's distressed spirit. "Can you tell me what happened?" As Agatha's soothing voice reached her, the shivering woman on the sofa abruptly halted her muttering. She mumbled something incoherent before suddenly raising her head. Agatha was met with a pair of eyes brimming with a terrifying mix of fear and insanity. "He returned, he came back, I killed him, I killed that monster, in the bathroom. It dissolved right there in the bathroom," she blurted out. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. The woman's eyes, inflamed with the hue of a deep and disturbed insomnia, seemed to contain a volatile cocktail of wild insanity and paralyzing terror. Although the soothing words of the gatekeeper had breathed a semblance of tranquility into her spirit, it had only been enough to pull her back from the precipice of a mental breakdown. Nevertheless, the whispering specter of fear that haunted her psyche could not be exorcised entirely. This was a look that Agatha, the experienced gatekeeper, had encountered countless times. Thus, with an air of resolute calm, she locked eyes with the woman, managing to kindle some semblance of stability in her. Once the woman's trembling had noticeably lessened, Agatha pressed for more information. "The man you speak of is your deceased husband, correct? You claim that he returned to your home, despite having passed away several years prior." Upon hearing her confirmation, the woman's body responded with violent shudders. She bowed her head, and her hands grasped at her hair as if desperately attempting to anchor herself to reality, incapable of maintaining Agatha's probing gaze. He came back, but I know it wasn't him," echoed ominously from her lips, like a chilling chorus of dread. Contorting her brows in concern, Agatha inquired further, "Can you recount how you managed to fend off this entity? Can you detail the events of the encounter?" While speaking, Agatha reached into her pocket and produced a small potion bottle. The cap was removed with a deft flick of her wrist, releasing a calming aroma that subtly perfumed the room. The potion's soothing effects were almost immediate. The woman, who had been writhing in distress moments ago, now rested on the sofa with noticeably more peaceful respiration. As she lifted her head slightly, her gaze timidly peeking through her disheveled hair, she whispered, I struck it from behind with a hammer. It fell down, but despite a significant indentation in its skull, it didn't perish. It tried to rise again. I panicked and kicked it into the bathroom, locking the door. It pounded on the door, emitting the most ghastly shrieks. It continued its horrible wails for nearly 10 minutes in the early dawn before finally falling silent. She paused briefly, collecting her thoughts before continuing in a barely audible voice. Later, when I cautiously cracked open the bathroom door, the creature had vanished. Agatha nodded in response, carefully cataloging the events in her mind. And what about its arrival? Do you recall how this entity made its return? I don't know, the woman responded, her voice trembling with pure terror. It just materialized in the house. The doors were locked, but I heard strange noises in the living room. Emerging from the bedroom, I was met with the sight of that thing. It was dressed in the clothing we buried my husband in, aimlessly wandering around the living room, producing sickening, squelching sounds as if it was filled with decaying, gelatinous matter. Agatha's facial expression swiftly morphed into one of stern seriousness. Just as she was about to respond, a guardian broke the tension with an update. We've thoroughly inspected all entrances and exits of the premises. All doors and windows are intact with no signs of forced entry, and all windows appear to be locked from the inside. All the doors and windows of the house were securely shut, their locks completely intact, yet this deceptive entity had somehow manifested directly within the home's confines. This startlingly sudden appearance of the creature, devoid of any semblance of an open invasion or attack, heightened her sense of vigilance even further. However, it was the unique aspects of this case that particularly piqued Agatha's interest today. She cast her gaze downwards, observing the woman slumped on the couch, still wrestling with her shaken nerves. Agatha could vividly recall the past cases she had dealt with. The haunting incident at 42 Fireplace Street, where a folklorist was tormented by the revenant of death, and the case of the unsuspecting female apprentice, who suffered severe cognitive contamination, remained fresh in her memory. In such instances, the survivors were typically oblivious to the counterfeit entities that haunted them. The woman before Agatha, however, had identified the intruder. She had spotted the charade. Could it be that she had remained untouched by cognitive contamination? Madam, Agatha began, choosing her words cautiously, how did you conclude that this monster was not your husband? How could it possibly be him? My husband passed away years ago, and that monstrosity was all wrong, a mockery of his image. How could it ever be my husband? The woman's agitation grew, her voice rising in pitch. Furthermore, it was heading towards my child, who referred to the creature as Daddy. He must have been manipulated by that abhorrent thing. So, in your belief that the monster had influenced your child, you nearly strangled him? Agatha asked, her brow creasing into a deep frown. Were you aware of your actions at the time? I didn't strangle him. I was merely attempting to pull him away. I didn't choke him. Her denial exploded from her like a gunshot, causing her to leap from the sofa as if preparing to assault the gatekeeper. The fear and madness that had haunted her bloodshot eyes flared up once again, obliterating all semblance of reason. The nearby guardians instantly moved to subdue the hysterical woman, but Agatha was quicker. With a swift movement, Agatha raised her staff and delicately tapped the woman's forehead. The impact instantly rendered the woman unconscious. She's terrified, muttered the short-haired female captain, shaking her head in sympathy. These kinds of incidents are far too overwhelming for ordinary people. No, it's not simply terror, it's a distinct form of mental contamination, Agatha corrected, shaking her head and furrowing her brows. She's teetering on the edge of temporary insanity, preserving only the most basic communicative capabilities. She hasn't suffered cognitive or memory interference. Although the exact reason remains unknown, she was able to discern the counterfeit nature of the entity. However, this revelation of truth has proven traumatic for her. While speaking, she cast a glance around the humble dwelling. Where is the child? The child has been relocated to a secure location for the time being. After experiencing such trauma and a near suffocation, he may not be in a state to endure questioning. Understood, Agatha commanded. Maintain a separation between the mother and child for the time being. Ensure they receive appropriate care and psychological therapy, with particular emphasis on the child. Offer him utmost comfort. Should they recall any information of importance, ensure that it is immediately relayed to me. Acknowledged, Gatekeeper. With a curt nod of approval, Agatha ambled through the living room towards the modestly sized bathroom. The floor area surrounding the showerhead was littered with indicators left behind by the Guardians during their evidence collection. The so-called counterfeit had been confined within this bathroom, yet all it had left behind was a specimen barely the size of a test tube. This peculiarity struck her as highly unusual. While the nature of these counterfeits remained shrouded in mystery and their origins unknown, one fact was undeniable: they consisted of a quantifiable amount of physical substance. Even upon disintegration, this physical mass wouldn't simply evaporate into nothingness. Her brow creased in contemplation, and Agatha paced the narrow confines of the bathroom. Suddenly, she halted, her gaze fixed intently on a particular corner. Nestled within that corner was a rust-encrusted entrance to a drainpipe. She quickly approached the drain, tapping the worn-out cast iron grate with the end of her tin staff while scrutinizing the murky abyss within. The engulfing darkness within the drainpipe seemed to veil the truth. "You've got to be kidding me, damn it." Agatha suddenly gasped, a chilling realization washing over her, causing a frigid shudder to course through her veins. "Evacuate this building immediately. Relocate all the residents to nearby churches and public shelters." She briskly returned to the living room, rattling off instructions with fervent urgency. "Get in touch with the local municipality. Close down this building. No, seal off all auxiliary pipelines connected to this building, encompassing the sewage and water supply lines. Additionally, dispatch a team to the closest wastewater treatment facility and thoroughly inspect the sedimentation tanks and filters." The team captain was taken aback by the flurry of orders but offered no resistance. Her inherent obedience to the chain of command had her springing into action immediately. "Understood, gatekeeper." After delivering the directives, Agatha's attention was once again drawn to the unconscious woman sprawled on the sofa. What was it that had allowed this woman to remain unaffected by cognitive and memory interferences, enabling her to discern the true nature of the counterfeit? Even at this moment, this lingering query continued to plague Agatha's mind. Just then, a guardian who had been diligently scouring other rooms for clues rushed into the living room, a small object clutched in his hand. "Gatekeeper. We've found this." Agatha swiftly turned her attention towards the voice, and her eyes landed on a small, time-worn plaster figurine held in the guardian's grasp. It was an unmistakable effigy of the Frost Queen in profile. A representation of the Frost Queen. A few of the guardians in the room murmured among themselves, "Quite unexpected to find something like this here." Agatha's expression hardened as she moved towards the guardian and accepted the mid-bust statue of the Queen, which stood approximately 10 centimeters tall. She carefully scrutinized the detailed craftsmanship. "It's a genuine artifact from that era, identifiable by a distinct anti-counterfeiting mark located at the base of the sculpture." She made a swift judgment, then glanced up. "Where was this found?" Within a concealed compartment in a deep wall cabinet, the guardian who had unearthed the statue of the Queen promptly reported. Alongside it were coins and a commemorative album from the era of the Queen. It would appear that someone has been secretly cherishing the memories of the Frost Queen. Agatha fell silent for a moment, her gaze focused on the plaster figurine clutched in her hand. The Frost Queen, even after half a century, the residents of the city-state still harbored a concealed reverence for the Queen. This didn't surprise Agatha. That period represented a time of glory, an era dominated by a formidable queen. 50 years was not sufficient to obliterate all traces of her reign from the city-state. Many from the older generation who had lived through that period, as well as their children, were still significantly influenced by it. Indeed, the Queen still had a smattering of adherents among the populace. Half a century ago, such covert acts of remembrance could have resulted in a public hanging, but today, 50 years later, the restrictions against such practices had been noticeably relaxed. Throughout her tenure as the gatekeeper, Agatha had encountered such instances more than once. In most cases, if the people were simply indulging in the collecting of memorabilia, the guardians and sheriffs of today would seldom take strict action. At times, they would opt to turn a blind eye or merely offer a verbal warning. The inhabitants of this household had only collected a statue of the Queen, a handful of coins, and a booklet. In the grand scheme of things, it wasn't a major concern. However, in light of the recent anomalies that had occurred within this household, Agatha couldn't shake off a nagging suspicion. The individual embroiled in this incident hadn't been subjected to cognitive interference but had instead seen through the truth of the counterfeit. Could it be that this incident was somehow tied to the Queen's memorabilia present here? Agatha meticulously examined the hidden place that had concealed the items. As she observed the recess, she found it to be exactly as her subordinates had described it, a concealed memorial dedicated to the Frost Queen, devoid of any lingering traces of supernatural energy. Her eyes then moved to scrutinize the objects that her team had discovered within the compartment: a statue made of plaster, a collection of commemorative coins, and a small printed booklet. Half a century prior, mere possession of such objects would have warranted capital punishment. However, those fear-filled years of strained tension were long gone. Now, the governing body of Frost had to focus on the long-term stability of their city-state and safeguard their public image as upholders of justice. They couldn't overreact to citizens privately remembering their former queen. In this era, these innocent acts of commemoration usually attracted nothing more than a warning, or at most, a monetary penalty. Besides, the decision to issue warnings or fines rested in the hands of law enforcement officers, not the cathedral. Secular laws and regulations were beyond the purview of ecclesiastical authorities. "This is not our domain," Agatha declared with a shake of her head. "Document this discovery, notify the local security forces, and leave the rest to them. We will, however, retain these mementos for further examination, just in case they conceal something." Understood. Having coordinated the next steps at the site, Agatha rose from the worn-out sofa and inhaled deeply. There was an overwhelming amount to deal with, and she could not afford to dawdle here. "Don't forget to continue the investigation at the sewage plant and keep a close watch on the pipeline system in this district," she instructed her team before stepping out of the room. Beyond the room lay a narrow hallway, its antiquated stairs stretching forward under the muted glow of sparse lighting. Doors to two other apartments nearby had cautiously been cracked open, their inhabitants peering through, eyes wide with anxiety, observing the ongoing activity. Agatha raised her hand in acknowledgement. "Please return to your homes, gather your belongings, and await further instructions. We need to clear this area temporarily, but rest assured, we'll resolve the situation as swiftly as possible, and you'll be able to come back soon." With this, Agatha didn't wait for the inhabitants' responses. Instead, she moved down the staircase towards the exit on the ground floor. She didn't employ her usual method of travel, gray wind. Though she generally enjoyed the speed and convenience it provided, her mind was in disarray today, cluttered with numerous pressing matters. A slow, leisurely walk would assist her in mentally organizing these concerns. She also aimed to absorb the residual energy in the entire building on the off chance that she could detect any faint signs of elemental contamination elsewhere. With these thoughts in mind, she descended the weathered staircase to the entrance and stepped out into the open space surrounding the residential building. The stale, pungent aroma that had been lingering in the air dissipated immediately, replaced by the bracingly fresh, cold air of the outside world. This sudden shift in ambiance revitalized Agatha's senses, even leading her to momentarily envision herself emerging from a dark, damp dungeon into the radiant sunlight. The throng of people that had previously gathered outside the residential building had now dispersed, leaving behind only a handful of curious bystanders who pointed and whispered amongst themselves from a safe distance. However, upon Agatha's emergence, even these lingering observers hastily made their departure. Yet, someone else remained. A furrow creased Agatha's forehead as she noticed a young woman with a concealed face, golden hair cascading down her back, and a bulky paper bag cradled in her arms. The woman stood in the open space before the building, seemingly lost in contemplation. "The area is under quarantine. It's not safe to linger," Agatha cautioned as she approached, her tone firm. "Are you a resident here?" The veiled blonde woman seemed startled, jolted back into the present. She turned to regard Agatha, pointing at herself in puzzlement. "Are you speaking to me?" "Of course. Who else could I be referring to?" Agatha frowned, slightly unnerved by the stranger in front of her. While she was certain she had no prior acquaintance with the woman, there was an eerie familiarity about her appearance, as if she had crossed paths with her recently. "Do you live here?" "No, not here," the woman, Alice, quickly waved her hand dismissively and gestured vaguely into the distance. "I reside over there, not that far away." "What happened here? I heard there was a fatality." The city guardians are addressing the situation, Agatha responded casually, her bewilderment growing as she was not recognized by Alice, the city's gatekeeper. However, Alice seemed oblivious to the increasingly perplexed gaze of the bandaged woman standing in front of her. She found Agatha's dark attire intriguing because it reminded her of the captain's current appearance. The captain, however, had cautioned her against hastily judging people based on their appearances and against revealing too much about herself to strangers. The former was deemed impolite, the latter recklessly incautious. While Alice couldn't articulate these two concepts, she trusted in the captain's wisdom. It was time to take her leave. So, with a friendly wave towards Agatha, Alice said cheerfully, "I must be off now. Thank you for answering my question." With that, the veiled blonde woman departed, her demeanor radiating a light-hearted, untroubled air. As Agatha watched her leave, an inexplicable unease settled over her. What was that woman's purpose here? In her 2 decades of living in this city-state, Agatha had never encountered anyone quite like Alice, a woman who exuded an indescribable aura of simplicity and joy, conversed with an unprecedented openness, and smiled with an innocence free of any hidden depths. Agatha's brow furrowed, a startling realization dawning upon her only after the woman had departed. No breath or heartbeat. The youthful gatekeeper immediately lifted her gaze towards the direction where the blonde woman had vanished, her instincts urging her to pursue. However, the hurried sound of approaching footsteps halted her impulse. A guardian dressed in dark attire hurried towards her, clutching a piece of intelligence dispatch in his hand, an expression of deep anxiety etched across his face. What happened? Agatha inquired sharply, not allowing the guardian a moment to speak before she voiced her own unease, as if things weren't chaotic enough, surely there can't be more complications. An urgent message arrived from cemetery number 3, the black-clad guard quickly informed, standing rigidly upright. Mysterious visitor, clues, the original is on site. A brief pause overtook Agatha as she quickly snatched the missive from the guardian's grasp, her eyes scanning the script hastily. The young gatekeeper remained silent, motionless as if she were frozen in place, offering no response for an uncomfortable stretch of time. The black-clad guardian cast a concerned glance towards his superior, unable to contain his worry after a few beats. "Gatekeeper, regarding this matter." Agatha slowly turned her gaze, locking eyes with her subordinate. "What would be your course of action if someone abruptly informed you that a being of ancient god-like stature had physically manifested in our city-state, and their choice of mortal dwelling was a terraced 2-story house, leased through the Citizens Help Center?" "I would probably seek spiritual counsel at the nearest church or consult a reputable psychiatrist," the black-clad guardian candidly replied. "You're not wrong, but regrettably, I already serve as the representative for the highest priestly institution in the city-state, and the arrival of an ancient god is not a predicament a psychiatrist can resolve." Agatha sighed, meticulously folding the letter. Every issue carries significance, each problem demands immediate attention. She cast her gaze towards Oak Street with a heavy sigh, highlighted in the intelligence report. Intriguingly, it was the same direction the peculiar, seemingly lifeless blonde woman had ventured off towards. Brimming with excitement, Nina dashed throughout the entire house, eventually making her way into the kitchen, where she marveled at the superior quality of the cookware compared to those at Plan's house. On the other hand, Shirley and Dog meandered about the living and dining rooms on the first floor, playfully assuming the roles of inspectors, and pausing occasionally to critique the decor. In addition, perched upon a nearby dining table, I found herself buried under a mountain of fries, a veritable feast for her. After being cooped up on the vanished for so long, this provided a much-needed respite for the group. Reclining on the living room sofa, Duncan watched the scene unfold with a concealed smile. Though thick layers of bandages hid his amusement, Vanna, standing beside him, inexplicably sensed that the captain's eyes reflected the warmth of a doting father in that moment. Vanna rapidly shook her head, dismissing the bizarre comparison that had sprung to mind, her gaze shifting towards the 2 girls and a dog darting around the house. "Have you checked out the empty room upstairs that's been allocated for you?" she inquired. We did. Nina bounded over enthusiastically, nodding emphatically. "It's fantastic, even more spacious than my room at Plan's." "This place is really incredible." Shirley joined the conversation, a radiant smile illuminating her face. If I had known you guys had such a comfortable setup in the city-state, I would have hopped aboard 2 days ago. Being on the ship is so monotonous. There's absolutely nothing to do. Duncan slowly swiveled his head in her direction. I left you with plenty of homework, enough to occupy you for 3 hours each day. How could you possibly have nothing to do? Caught off guard by her own blunder, Shirley visibly recoiled. Did you complete her assignments for her? Duncan's gaze dropped towards Dog, who was doing his utmost to melt into the shadows. Dog seemed to shrink further under the scrutiny. I did it for extra practice, not wanting your efforts in educating us to be wasted. Duncan released a hearty laugh, clearly amused by the scene. Ease up. I invited you here for some relaxation, not to berate you, he gestured dismissively, his eyes falling upon the wall clock. Alice should be returning shortly, and we still have about an hour until dinner. Shirley, it's time to catch up on your homework, starting from page 16 of your textbook. After a prolonged period of silence, Shirley's desolate wail filled the air, a haunting lament that reverberated in the ears of both Vanna and Morris. Duncan found himself reclining comfortably on the plush sofa in the living room, engrossed in the pages of the newspaper he had picked up from a local vendor that same morning. He would occasionally shift his gaze, taking in the sight of Shirley as she furrowed her brows in concentration, diligently penning down words on a paper that lay on the coffee table. He also observed Dog, who seemed to be wholly absorbed in his reading of A Brief History of the City-State. In this unsettling and ominous reality that they found themselves in, Duncan had managed to carve out a semblance of familiar normalcy. The everyday routine provided a sense of reassurance, a comforting rhythm that echoed the life he had once led on Earth. Duncan's thoughts turned towards an idea he had entertained for a while. With Dog, Shirley, and Nina's presence, he had successfully resurrected an old dream of his, reinstating the small, intimate learning environment he once called Captain Duncan's classroom. This time, though, it was not on Earth but in this strange new world. He cast a glance across the coffee table to see Nina, who was perched on a petite stool, engrossed in completing her winter break homework. Morris was hovering nearby, supervising her progress and occasionally offering guidance to correct minor errors. You're doing a commendable job, Morris, Duncan complimented. Nina's fortunate to have you. Morris responded with a warm smile. She's a diligent young girl, and I wouldn't want to inhibit her growth in any way. He then turned to glance at Shirley's open workbook, his expression subtle yet revealing. I must admit, I didn't anticipate your aptitude for teaching others. Duncan arched an eyebrow in curiosity. Oh, is that so? The structured study plan you've outlined for Shirley, Alice, and Dog is logical, even professional, Morris confessed, albeit with a touch of hesitance, and the examination papers you'd prepared earlier, they were quite professional as well. It's rather surprising. Morris seemed to choose his words carefully, demonstrating his genuine concern for the matter at hand. Initially, when he learned of Duncan's keen intent to tutor the trio who hadn't yet learned to read, he didn't envisage structured learning materials like flashcards and workbooks or basic arithmetic exercises. Instead, he imagined a more chaotic, perhaps even sinister scene, akin to a cult seeking forbidden knowledge. However, Morris was forced to reevaluate his expectations upon seeing the fearsome Captain Duncan whip out a stack of literacy flashcards. While he had gradually adapted to Duncan's off-duty persona, amiable and pacifistic, the thought of such a notorious figure from subspace earnestly imparting knowledge, particularly literacy, still felt rather disconcerting. Knowing the underlying meaning in Morris's carefully chosen words, Duncan offered a casual response, dismissively waving his hand with a grin. Perhaps, in another life, I dreamed of being a teacher. Caught off guard, Morris fell silent. Meanwhile, Duncan cast a glance at Shirley's less than perfect penmanship and sighed. Sadly, the disparate learning progress among these three pupils can be quite exasperating. Morris fell silent, pondering for a moment before he agreed with a nod. Indeed. It seems like Dog could potentially self-study in a library all the way to a college degree while Shirley is still grappling with simple words. And Alice is. Duncan released another sigh, completing his sentence. Alice is hardworking, but in the end, she's still Alice. The learning curve of the trio on board the ship, who were initially unable to read, hadn't followed the trajectory that Duncan had expected. He had anticipated Shirley, with her innate intelligence, to make quicker progress. However, her stubborn refusal to embrace learning and her despondent attitude had resulted in her remaining semi-literate. Alice, in contrast, displayed commendable perseverance, yet her puppet-like cognitive abilities didn't seem particularly attuned to the nuances of reading and writing. Surprisingly, it was Dog who proved to be the most proficient learner. He had advanced to reading literature independently and even solving cubic equations, demonstrating an unexpected level of diligence and comprehension. Of the numerous shadowy hunters in pursuit of knowledge, it appeared that only Dog had managed to keep pace. In all honesty, this was a significant blemish on Duncan's, or rather Zhou Ming's, otherwise pristine teaching record. While Duncan sighed inwardly, Alice, who had stepped out earlier to pick up groceries, finally made her return, arriving nearly 20 minutes later than anticipated. I'm back. As Alice stepped into the room and set her shopping down, she greeted everyone present. Noticing the top student, the underachiever, and the scholarly Dog diligently engrossed in their work, a bright smile illuminated her face. Nina. Surely. Dog. You're all here. We arrived this morning, and I've been doing homework for the majority of the day. Shirley looked up, her eyes glistening with tears. The captain said I have to redo everything from page 16 onwards in my vocabulary book. 3 times, Duncan interjected calmly, don't conveniently cut your task down by 2/3. Choosing to disregard Shirley's subsequent reaction, he turned his attention to Alice. What kept you? Did you run into any issues? No, not at all. Alice responded quickly, waving her hands dismissively. I just came across something intriguing, I didn't stop to watch. I was conducting an investigation. Alice, a puppet by nature, was terribly inept at lying and concealing the truth. Her hastily concocted excuse quickly revealed the fact that she had been delayed by something interesting that had caught her attention en route. Investigating. Duncan looked at Alice, his interest piqued. Despite having warned her not to wander off, he wasn't particularly concerned about her slight detour. It was a minor issue. What intrigued him more was that Alice, who was usually rather oblivious, was now using words like investigating with unusual seriousness. Even if it were merely a spur-of-the-moment fabrication, Duncan found himself intrigued by what Alice claimed to have investigated. On a nearby street, there was a household, and someone had died. The clergy was present. Alice began her tale, detailing her observations during her detour on the way home. A woman confessed to killing her husband, and the bystanders mentioned the man had passed away before. Oh, and I saw a woman who dresses just like you. She was covered in bandages too. Duncan attempted to follow Alice's somewhat disjointed and vague narrative, trying to piece together what had transpired. When he picked up on the mention of a bandaged woman, his eyebrows knitted together. Just as he was about to delve deeper into this detail, he noticed Vanna, who had been feeding at the dining table, abruptly stand up. There's a stranger approaching, Vanna reported tersely. It's a member of the clergy. Immediately, Duncan signaled Alice to be silent and don her veil again. Dog, who had been perched by the sofa, evaporated into the shadows within a blink of an eye. I fluttered her wings and sought refuge atop a nearby cabinet while Morris rose from his seat, making his way towards the door. Stay calm, we merely have a visitor, Duncan reassured everyone composedly. He nodded to Vanna and Morris's tension before leisurely strolling to the door and swinging it open. A young woman stood outside, dressed in a black trench coat, swathed in bandages, donning a black round hat, and clutching a staff. She was frozen in the midst of raising her hand to knock. For a moment, it was as though time stood still. Duncan took a moment to study the woman from head to toe before glancing down at his own attire. Ah, a fashion collision, he quipped casually. That's her. That's her. Standing slightly behind Duncan, Alice finally caught sight of their visitor and leaned in excitedly. The woman in black I told you about, the one I saw when I was returning from shopping. Alice's voice seemed to snap the visitor out of her daze. Agatha's facial muscles twitched slightly, and after a concerted effort, she managed to drag her gaze away from the towering figure before her to the source of the voice. The breathless, golden-haired girl she had encountered a short while ago was standing inside the house, observing her with a mixture of curiosity and delight. So she was indeed here. Agatha drew several deep breaths, her efforts focused on steadying the wild galloping of her heart. The faint ringing that had started in her ears gradually subsided, and the darkness that had descended over her vision and the afterimages spawned by her abrupt confrontation with the truth slowly began to dissolve. A sigh of relief slipped from her lips as she recalled the reason behind her visit. A stiff and discomforting smile began to form on her face. I didn't mean to intrude. I came to assess the situation, and you. Come in, Duncan replied, an air of indifference in his voice. He gestured for her to enter. It's rather chilly outside. We do not need to stand in the doorway to converse. Caught off guard, Agatha hesitated, seemingly unable to process his response. Observing this, Vanna, who had been quietly standing nearby, found herself frowning at the woman. You rushed here fully aware of what this place is, yet you didn't consider the possibility of what might occur once the door was opened. Cut her some slack, Morris quickly interjected. It's only natural to be taken aback upon meeting the captain for the first time. The higher one's spiritual vision, the more pronounced this reaction tends to be. This poor girl is clearly at sea. At Morris's words, Vanna's mind went back to her own initiation into the crew of the Vanished and conceded that the old man had a point. As Vanna and Morris carried on their exchange, Agatha finally collected herself. Although her thoughts were still in somewhat of a tumult, her rationality had wrestled back control. With Duncan deliberately damping down his overwhelming presence, she found her cognition wasn't significantly disturbed. She hurriedly apologized. I'm sorry, I was momentarily dazed. Then she took a cursory look at the space Duncan had created for her and took a step forward after a brief pause of hesitation. She was well aware of what this place represented. She also knew that the imposing figure she had encountered was essentially an unspeakable entity that had descended upon the city-state, whose rank potentially rivaled the ancient gods. She knew she was venturing into a fallen site. However, when the door swung open, retreat was no longer an option. Behind Duncan, Morris watched the tightly wound young woman enter the house and murmured to Vanna, "She's handling this better than you did initially." Vanna retorted softly, "That wasn't my fault. The captain was downright terrifying the first time he entered my dream." Morris conceded with a nod, "That's fair." Vanna added, "But I was significantly calmer the second time around." Overhearing the quiet exchange between the two, Duncan finally couldn't resist turning around to admonish them. "Neither of you were particularly composed the second time either. Keep it down, we have a guest." In a fusion of growing unease and raw intrigue, Agatha discreetly examined her surroundings. At a casual glance, the environment was nothing more than a typical dwelling. The bulk of the furniture may have been somewhat behind the times, but it was evidently cared for and in immaculate condition. The indoor atmosphere was crisp, signaling that the windows had been ajar for ventilation a short while ago. A distinctive sound of simmering water emanated from the kitchen, almost as if a pot of tea was in the making. The setting didn't strike her as a point of arrival. It was entirely ordinary, nothing more than a residential home. That said, Agatha had been aware right from the get-go that this was a standard home, no more, no less. Up until a few days prior, it had even been up for lease at the local community rental center. However, the fact that it was chosen as a temporary abode by a mysterious guest had piqued her interest, leading her to wonder if there was something peculiar about the place. But, as far as she could tell, there was nothing out of the ordinary. "Would you like some tea? Or maybe coffee?" Duncan proposed nonchalantly as he approached Agatha. Caught off guard, Agatha looked startled as she turned to face Duncan, who had settled beside her. It took her a second to process his question, after which she hastily gestured a decline. "No, thanks, I'm not parched." "Don't stand on ceremony. Make yourself at home," Duncan offered with a genial smile, comfortably sinking into the sofa facing Agatha. "Allow me to hazard a guess, if my instincts serve me right, you're the city-state's guardian. It seems unlikely that a routine guardian would make a domestic visit at this hour." "Gatekeeper Agatha," she corrected swiftly with a nod, making an effort to maintain her composure. "Did you anticipate my arrival? Either you were destined to arrive or someone else higher up in the church's ranks," Duncan responded with a touch of indifference. "Annie would notify the gravekeeper about my presence, and the gravekeeper, in turn, would inform the church. All I had to do was sit tight and await the arrival of the senior church official from this city-state." Adjusting her posture subtly, Agatha looked more intently at the imposing figure seated across from her. "I need to understand your true motives. What is your identity, and what has brought you to Frost? Didn't I state it already? Duncan raised a questioning eyebrow. I'm here to tackle the issues that have cropped up here. I was under the impression that I made that clear in my report. Agatha's mouth opened, her struggle evident as she grappled with such a straightforward response. After a brief pause, she inquired tentatively, is it, really that simple? If you're in need of a more sinister motive and an elaborate scheme to find this situation believable, I'm more than capable of concocting one right here, right now, Duncan replied with a hint of nonchalance. What's your preference? Doomsday scenario or world domination? At this, Agatha's body stiffened perceptibly. You certainly managed to spook her, Vanna interjected suddenly, a couple of mild coughs punctuating her words from behind Duncan. This woman, the gatekeeper, she'll take it to heart. Will she, really? Duncan rotated slightly, an expression of bewilderment marking his features. I assumed it was clearly a jest. Drawing from personal experience, she will, Vanna conceded with a resigned sigh. Those who operate in our line of work are perpetually on tenterhooks, their sense of humor tends to be a bit lacking. Caught off guard, Duncan momentarily stumbled over his words. Simultaneously, Agatha regarded the towering woman with an air of confusion. For some unfathomable reason, ever since she stepped into the room, she had felt the intensity of Vanna's focus on her, as if she was being subjected to meticulous observation. But this is of little consequence. The crucial point is that she ascertained that the superior entity before her was merely toying with her through an ill-conceived, intimidating jest. I apologize for my overly cautious disposition, Agatha voiced out earnestly. The recent surge in aberrations within the city-state has heightened everyone's nervousness. I even started to suspect. She stalled, uncertain about how to complete her train of thought. Duncan, however, seamlessly carried on for her. Suspected me, did you? It's understandable, given the coincidence of my appearance and the immediate interactions I've had with the annihilators and counterfeits. Agatha lapsed into silence, a blush of embarrassment coloring her features. I'd be interested to learn about the advancements you've made in your investigations, Duncan suggested, unperturbed by her reaction. Have you been able to unearth any leads? Agatha appeared torn, hesitant about divulging too much proprietary information to this mysterious visitor. However, after a beat, she cautiously began to articulate, following your warning, we indeed apprehended a few members of the Annihilation cult but garnered nearly no valuable intel. Those heretical minds, in a deep symbiotic relationship with the shadow demons, are incredibly resilient and often choose to self-annihilate at the very last instant. The ones we managed to seize alive are merely peripheral players with little knowledge about the grand scheme. As of now, we can only affirm that the frequent cloning phenomenon in the city is indeed attributable to these heretics, and they have successfully established a sprawling, hidden lair within Frost. However, as for the exact whereabouts of this hideout, we're still in the dark. Pausing for a moment, Agatha then proceeded, regarding Dagger Island, the one you referred to in your letter, what's more unsettling is that it has vanished. I'm aware, Duncan responded impassively. You were already in the know. Agatha inquired, visibly taken aback. This piece of news is supposed to be classified. Duncan retorted calmly, I have my independent sources. Even without leaving the city-state, I stay informed about certain occurrences out in the outer sea. Indeed, the source of this intelligence was Tyrion. After all, Dagger Island had dematerialized right before the eyes of the Mist Fleet. It stood to reason that the Iron Admiral would convey the circumstances to the vanished. Even with the shocking revelation, Duncan was left astounded but nothing more. The seemingly impossible phenomenon of such a vast island evaporating into thin air was beyond his comprehension. According to the information relayed by Tyrion, the island's vanishing act didn't involve sinking but rather a sudden dissolution into the sea. Preceding its disappearance was a series of persistent explosions, indicating that someone or something on the island had been activated. But beyond that piece of intel, further information was notably scant. Due to the meager details at hand, the peculiar mode of disappearance, and the absence of any residual traces post-disappearance, Dagger Island had evolved from an enigma into an even more profound mystery. The happenings on the island were unknown, and the island's current whereabouts were equally elusive. Do you know where Dagger Island has gone? Agatha's voice cut through Duncan's musings. The gatekeeper of the city-state looked up at him with earnest eyes. Do you understand what transpired there? Pondering for a moment, Duncan felt that confessing his fruitless all-night ruminations might taint his reputation. Therefore, after a brief hesitance, he pointed towards the ground. Beneath. Agatha recoiled in surprise. Are you suggesting that Dagger Island has sunk into the ocean, but the eyewitness testimonies claimed there were no visible whirlpools on the sea surface indicative of an island submerging? Duncan was at a loss for words. He was equally perplexed about the abrupt vanishing of such a colossal island. Nevertheless, he continued to point downwards, right at his feet. You're not referring to Dagger Island, you mean the hint lies beneath our feet. Agatha seemed to grasp his implication, and almost instantaneously, she recollected her recent conversation with Archbishop Ivan about the second waterway, buried deep beneath the ground. City Hall and the Death Church had scoured the entire city-state. The stringent curfew and repetitive large-scale sweeps should theoretically have ensnared a significant number of concealed cultists, but the detainees were always mere foot soldiers. The initial waterway, subway, pipeline wells, and other potential hideouts had also been inspected thoroughly, yet there were no leads. The city-state had its physical boundaries. If the aforementioned locations failed to yield any traces of these heretics, the only remaining possibility was the second waterway. The collapsed sections, the gloomy caves, the contaminated vertical shafts, and pipes, they might indeed not be conducive to survival, but what if, against all odds, those cultists had managed to endure in such adverse conditions? Of course, conducting a thorough investigation of the second waterway had already been in the plans, but Agatha had been apprehensive about confirming whether this unavoidably resource-draining search operation held any substantial significance. Now, however, she had stumbled upon the most compelling justification for this undertaking. An affable entity of godlike stature had explicitly indicated the need to search beneath the surface. I see, it all makes sense now. We're on the correct path. Agatha sprang to her feet, her voice brimming with enlightenment and jubilation. She regarded Duncan, seated across from her, with an attitude that had suddenly morphed into one of sincere respect, and she proceeded to bow deeply. I get it. Thank you profusely for your insightful guidance. Meanwhile, Duncan continued to point at the floor, appearing slightly bemused by the bandaged woman's sudden outburst of enthusiasm. What exactly had she comprehended? We will promptly initiate the next phase of the search operation, and this time, we will surely unearth the hideout of the heretics. Agatha, oblivious to Duncan's bafflement, spoke with confidence. She was soon ready to depart. I won't consume any more of your time. Please excuse my interruption. I must take my leave. Okay. Duncan rose a moment too late, responding instinctively, take care. Agatha thanked him, turned around, and proceeded towards the door. Suddenly, she halted as though she had remembered something important. Alice, who was just about to stand up to bid her farewell, almost collided with her. Agatha cast a glance at Alice, but she didn't seem too perturbed by the blonde woman who lacked a heartbeat and breath. It was quite common for a godlike entity to be accompanied by followers with unusual traits, nothing to be surprised about. She shifted her gaze back to Duncan. I assure you, I will instruct the church's guardians. No one will come to bother you, Agatha stated solemnly. I hope you enjoy your stay in Frost. If there are any new developments, I will personally come to update you. Ah, well, that's great, Duncan responded with a chuckle. He was genuinely pleased with that. I truly appreciate the privacy. Agatha nodded, then turned to exit through the door again. However, after only a couple of steps, she halted, seemingly having remembered something else. There's one more thing I almost forgot. The gatekeeper seemed slightly flustered as she touched her forehead, looking back at Duncan. Duncan appeared puzzled. Oh. After a moment of hesitation, Agatha finally voiced the question that had been plaguing her and many others for a considerable amount of time. About the secret number you included at the end of your last report letter, could you elucidate its meaning? I beg your pardon for our limited understanding. We've been attempting to decode it for quite some time, but we're yet to unravel the riddle you've left behind. Duncan. E.H.